Congo, by the best estimates, the population, the native population of the Congo had been diminished by 50%. And this is not just from direct beatings and shootings associated with rubber boom. This is also associated with forced labor to build railroads, all kinds of other activities associated with this colony. But again, actually, the story is quite remarkable because much of the news of this, when it came out, was coming from American missionaries and the American black press and church press in the United States, exposing these stories to the media in the U.S. It would get to Europe, and then there were all kinds of inquiries, right? There were special commissions formed to investigate this and see whether it was true. And Leopold managed to contain the story for a long, long time and deny that it was happening and insist that it was false and that it was a bunch of propaganda being perpetrated by his enemies and that sort of thing. But it was essentially the sort of conscience of the world was eventually awakened to this through the work of American missionaries and other missionaries, many of them African or of African descent, working through networks from the U.S. to the United Kingdom and then to Europe. And this, eventually was reined in, but it took a great deal longer than it should have. We can take a 5-minute break. We haven't got much time left for the rest of these slides, so we're going to go a little quickly here. Just to quickly sort of bring this up to the present, this is a map depicting the mineral resources of what's now the Democratic Republic of Congo, although it's scarcely a republic and scarcely democratic. So tin, gold, coal, copper, what else? There are a lot of things. Manganese, diamonds, oil, iron ore, bauxite. There is an incredible wealth of minerals in addition to the rainforest in Congo. And as you can see, much of it is concentrated in the extreme eastern edge of the country. You can read about this in the news today if you want. In many ways, the sort of mayhem and chaos continues up to the present, not in the form of the cutting off of hands, perhaps, I hope, but in fact, in many ways, arguably even more disgusting, at least at certain moments. This is a total free-for-all zone right now. Militias and violence of all kinds. It crops up in the New York Times periodically. I believe, 3 million people dead in the last 10 years, something like that. Estimated. Of course, nobody really knows for sure. It just came up again just recently. Anyway, the legacy that King Leopold's Ghost, this book that I referred you to, I mean, one of the things that he wishes to document and establish is precisely this question of how many people died. And it's not an easy question to answer. And his estimate of half the population by 1908 is an estimate. But when he says King Leopold's Ghost, in many ways what he's talking about is the ghost of that mortality, the ghost of the decimation of the population, and the ways in which that crippled the country, crippled the area, crippled the people of the area for generations to come. And this is, in fact, one of the legacies that we're trying to think about here when we think about colonialism and its effects on the 20th century. In any case, the legacy of corruption, extraordinary exploitation of people and resources, feeding into the hands of a very small number of people. If you're familiar with Mobutu, this happened after independence as well as under colonialism, and in many ways is still happening to this day. So, change from the Belgians to the British. The British, of course, were much more powerful than the Belgians. They were the most powerful imperial power in 1885, and this was built on things that had already happened by that point in time, and one of the key arenas for this was Egypt. We've talked about the Suez Canal, and I've mentioned this before. The British took over the Suez Canal shares from Egypt in 1875. In other words, they bailed out the Egyptian government financially. They took on the debt that the Egyptian government had acquired in an effort to build the Suez Canal. Britain and France, sort of struggling under the load of the debt associated with the Suez Canal, took over financial control of Egypt in 1879. Basically said, we're going to do the books so that we can make sure that we can get from you the payments that you owe us on this debt. This was an exploitative relationship. The Egyptians didn't take kindly to it, and they rose up in revolt in 1882, and the British military came in and crushed the revolts and took possession of the country and remained in power until the 1950s. They were primarily concerned in this to secure the shipping route to India through the Suez Canal. That was what they cared about. Because of their control of India and the massive amounts of trade that they were conducting between Asia and Europe, the Suez Canal was extraordinarily valuable to them, and they were not going to put up with any situation that would interrupt their ability to ship through it. Meanwhile, at the other end of the continent in South Africa, they fought a series of wars, the First and Second Boer Wars, against the descendants of the earlier Dutch colonists there, largely motivated here by diamonds and gold, which were extraordinarily abundant. And they won these wars and took over control of South Africa. Here we see industry and mining mineral resources in South Africa, again, extraordinarily rich in a variety of raw materials, minerals, especially diamonds and gold, but not only diamonds and gold. The British and the French were on a collision course. The French had a sphere of influence or control that extended east and west across the northern part of Africa and was almost complete. The British, meanwhile, had control in a sort of north-south corridor from South Africa to the Nile and on to Egypt, and they had visions of a gigantic railway that would unify the entirety of Africa and allow them to move goods very easily north and south from the Cape to Cairo. And in 1898, these two lines crossed. And of course, you can't have both of them satisfied. You can't run a line north-south and a line east-west and not have them cross. And they very nearly went to war over this. And in some ways, you could see this as a kind of preliminary skirmish that would be followed by, 15 years later, by World War I. Obviously, in that case, the British and the French were not at odds with each other, but in many ways, this was an anticipation of the kinds of conflicts that were brewing. Now, I want to talk briefly about what was learned in the British colonies in Africa and how it informed things that happened later. And this is an argument made by Hannah Arendt in a book called The Origins of Totalitarianism. She makes the case that Egypt provided the British with a kind of pilot or test case, a challenge which they solved through the development of colonial bureaucracy. That there was a necessity to organize and run a very large, complicated country, and to do it within the strictures of a government bureaucracy to protect their financial interest. Meanwhile, in South Africa, developed a political ideology of race and racism that was fomented in part by the Dutch and their extremely racist views towards the natives when they were in control down there, but which eventually issues into apartheid. And that Arendt's argument is that these two things, a bureaucratic system of organizing production for profit, and on the other end of the continent, a political apparatus that mobilized race as an ideology of rule. And she points out that in some cases, the pursuit of racism or the defense of racism in South Africa sometimes trumped profitableness itself. But that these two came together and informed British colonial practice elsewhere, and that they are both, in fact, necessary components of Nazism and Stalinism. That figuring out how to make bureaucracy and racism work together was, in a sense, what set the template for the rise of fascism in Europe. And we might come back to this when we talk about Orwell. So what's the outcome of all of this? Skipping ahead, glossing over God knows how many details from other parts of the continent. This table is taken from a Mike Davis book. The source is an economic study charting the shares of world gross domestic product from 1700 to 1952 between China, India, and Europe. And you see that in 1700 they had roughly equal shares of world production. 1820, China, in fact, was bigger than Europe in its overall production. By 1890, Europe had 2/5 of world production and dwarfed China and India. And by 1952, China and India had been reduced even further to mere fractions of what had been the case 250 years later. The only reason this number is smaller than this number, of course, is because of the rise of the United States. You can also look at it in terms of world manufacturing output from 1750 to 1900, and a similar pattern emerges. Europe in 1750 having a little less than 1/4 of world manufacturing. The tropics, in fact, having 3/4 of it. China nearly 1/3 all by itself. And by 1900, Europe has 63%, China just 6%, India less than 2%. The tropics as a whole, 13.4%. This is not to say that somehow the factories were lifted out of China and moved to Europe. It's to say that the growth of manufacturing in Europe was extraordinary, and the existing manufacturing capacity of places like India and China were reduced. They were driven under, sometimes by economic means, sometimes by political or military means. In any case, this is the sort of end result of this process of colonial imperial domination. Now, the question came up, sort of, what about the wives and kids? What about the people? What about, this is in some ways the human expression of this, right? The loss of half the population of the Congo, what does that do? What kind of lasting effect could that have? Would that have? There are other less extreme but similar directions, changes that you can document from other parts of the world. Mass mortality associated with famine, that kind of thing, not to mention wars. This is one possible way of thinking about this in the long run. Even 100 years later, the prevalence of stunted children could be interpreted as a legacy of the activities associated with this period of time. So, we don't have much time left. We'll get as far as we can here. So, what we have now is, there are a bunch of ways of depicting it, illustrating it, dramatic unevenness in the development of different parts of the world. This is what uneven development is intended to convey or signify. A systematic process of economic and social development that is uneven in space and time and endemic to capitalism. This is not Adam Smith. This is Neil Smith, writing in the Dictionary of Human Geography, 4th edition. This is perhaps one of the core concepts that modern geography has to offer you. The idea that development is uneven and that the driver of that unevenness is principally capitalism. Now, the examples of colonial empire are extreme and are global in scale, but this unevenness should not be thought of simply as a difference between the North and the South. Here are some ways of depicting this. The unevenness in national income. You can see that most of Africa is at the very low end of the scale. There are other scales at which this also can be understood. Think about uneven development not only between the first and third worlds or the global North and South, but within nations, between nations and within nations. Industrial versus agricultural areas, cities and countries, prosperous and stagnant regions. You can think about it at the scale of cities as well, or urban metropolitan areas, business centers, residential, industrial zones, inner cities versus suburbs. Basically, everywhere you look, you can find examples of this unevenness. And that is, it may sound banal, it may sound so ubiquitous as to be almost unenlightening, but if you really think hard about the distribution of power and wealth in space, the way it manifests in the built environments and distribution of people, this unevenness really screams out for some kind of explanation. It's everywhere. How do we make sense of it? Why is it uneven? An environmental determinist would say it's uneven because of nature. There are just certain parts of the world that have got better soils, better water, better climate, you name it, that were just put there by natural processes and make certain places better for producing goods than others, and therefore wealthier. This obviously doesn't make much sense, because if you look, for example, at the distribution of energy consumption, you will see very quickly that the energy is not consumed where nature put it. Most of it is consumed in places like the United States that are far away from where most of it resides in the ground in the form of oil. Okay? So that's obviously inadequate. We can think about it in terms of social processes, trade, moving those goods from where they were left by nature or put by nature to other places and blurring the unevenness, people building built environments that facilitate that movement until you get to a point where this built environment is, so to speak, a second nature that is produced and that is more important than the natural distribution that preceded. All right, I will stop there, and we will see you next week. Thanks a lot.